There was a time when narcissistic tactics thrived in silence. They survived in confusion, in self-doubt, in the spaces where people questioned their own reality more than they questioned the manipulation happening in front of them. Gaslighting worked because many did not yet have the language for it. Love bombing worked because intensity was mistaken for intimacy. Triangulation worked because comparison quietly eroded self-worth. For years, these patterns hid behind charm, authority, and even victimhood. But this is 2026, and something has shifted. People are more informed than ever. Conversations about emotional abuse are no longer whispered in private. They are discussed openly, analyzed, dissected, and understood. Emotional intelligence is not just a buzzword anymore. It is a survival skill. Boundaries are no longer seen as selfish. They are recognized as necessary. And when awareness rises, manipulation loses its oxygen. Narcissistic tactics depend on confusion. They depend on you doubting your instincts. They depend on you staying hooked into proving, fixing, rescuing, explaining. But when someone understands the pattern, the spell weakens. When someone recognizes gaslighting in real time, it stops being destabilizing and starts being predictable. And when it becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. What we are witnessing now is not the disappearance of narcissism. It is the collapse of its effectiveness. The old scripts are being exposed. The cycle of idealize, devalue, discard is no longer mysterious to those who have lived it and learned from it. People are documenting their experiences, validating one another, and refusing to internalize blame that was never theirs to carry. And perhaps most importantly, people are tired of shrinking themselves to maintain someone else's fragile ego, tired of apologizing for boundaries, tired of mistaking chaos for passion. That exhaustion has turned into clarity. And clarity is powerful. When you are clear about who you are and what you will not tolerate, manipulation has far less room to operate. So today, we are not here to talk about fear. We are here to talk about power. We are here to talk about what happens when awareness spreads faster than control tactics can adapt. We are here to talk about why the very strategies that once kept people trapped are now being recognized, challenged, and rejected. Because when insight replaces confusion and self-worth replaces self-doubt, the game changes. And in 2026, the game has changed. There comes a moment in life when the fog lifts and clarity emerges so sharply that nothing can obscure the truth anymore. That moment feels like awakening. An awakening to patterns, to repeated cycles, to the subtle ways some people try to bend reality to their will. For years, manipulation thrived in the shadows because people were unsure of their own instincts, hesitant to trust what they felt in their gut, unsure if their experience was valid or imagined. But now, the world is changing. And so are the rules. The tools that once controlled, coerced, and confused are losing their power because people are no longer willing to surrender their perception, their intuition, or their dignity. In your own life, this awakening is a personal revolution. You start to notice when a compliment comes with an invisible price, when charm is a mask for control, when kindness is contingent on compliance. You start to recognize gaslighting for what it is, manipulation dressed in everyday language, and you realize you no longer have to participate in someone else's distortion. The realization is liberating, but also humbling. It requires courage to see clearly, because seeing clearly means facing uncomfortable truths about relationships, work dynamics, or family patterns. It means acknowledging that some people will not change, and that the responsibility for your clarity lies entirely with you. Once you reach this point, the impact on your life is profound. You stop shrinking yourself to avoid conflict or maintain favor. You stop over-explaining, over-apologizing, and overcompensating. Your energy is no longer drained by constant attempts to correct someone else's narrative or to rescue someone from their own dysfunction. In its place, you feel a steady, unshakable confidence, a recognition that your reality is valid and your voice matters. Awareness becomes a shield and a guide, allowing you to navigate relationships with intention rather than reaction. You learn to listen to red flags without fear, to honor boundaries without guilt, to trust your instincts without hesitation. Manipulation no longer works because you see it for what it is the moment it appears. And with that vision comes freedom, because freedom is not about controlling others. It is about reclaiming control over your own mind, your own choices, and your own life. The awakening era is not a passive state. It is active, conscious, deliberate. It invites you to rise above the subtle pressures and invisible games, to recognize when influence is being attempted, and to respond from a place of clarity rather than confusion. It is a shift in perception, a reorientation of priorities, and a quiet revolution that happens one decision, one boundary, and one act of self-respect at a time. For years, narcissistic control relied on one simple principle: supply. The attention, validation, and emotional energy of others was their currency, and they were skilled at extracting it without regard for boundaries, feelings, or consequences. In your life, there may have been moments when you felt drained, confused, or complicit in maintaining someone else's fragile sense of self. You may have questioned why you gave so much of yourself for so little in return, why your empathy was used as leverage, and why your instincts told you something was wrong, even when the situation seemed normal. The shift begins when emotional intelligence enters the picture. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand your own feelings, recognize them in real time, and navigate your interactions with awareness and intentionality. It is the quiet force that dismantles manipulation because it removes the fuel that narcissists rely on. When you can identify patterns of control and respond rather than react, the games begin to lose their effect. You learn to recognize love bombing, guilt trips, and triangulation as tactics rather than genuine connection. You begin to see boundaries not as obstacles, but as essential tools for protecting your energy and self-respect. In your life, this means you stop giving attention where it is not earned. You stop providing explanations for your worth, and you stop feeling responsible for someone else's feelings at the expense of your own. The presence of emotional intelligence turns the tables. What once provoked anxiety, doubt, or overcompensation now meets clarity, calm, and consistency. You notice the strategies being used to manipulate, and you refuse to engage on those terms. This does not require confrontation or aggression. It requires observation, understanding, and strategic disengagement. The more you practice this, the less supply exists, and the less control they can exert. Without the reinforcement of your attention and emotional energy, manipulation falters. You begin to reclaim time, space, and inner peace that were previously siphoned off. Emotional intelligence also fosters empathy for yourself, helping you recognize patterns of past entanglement without shame or self-blame. You understand that saying no, walking away, or holding firm to your boundaries is not cruelty. It is survival, growth, and self-respect. With this newfound awareness, Interactions with narcissistic personalities are no longer a source of fear or chaos. You can observe without absorbing, respond without reacting, and disengage without guilt. In your life, the dismantling of control is not just about resisting someone else. It is about building an internal fortress of clarity, emotional stability, and self-trust. Each act of discernment chips away at the power structures that once kept you ensnared. Over time, the absence of supply reshapes the dynamic entirely, leaving manipulation impotent and freedom inevitable. Emotional intelligence becomes both armor and compass, guiding you through relationships with intention, protecting your energy, and affirming your autonomy in ways that manipulation can never touch. There is a profound shift that happens the moment you decide to honor your own boundaries. A shift so powerful that it changes the entire landscape of your relationships. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate. They are declarations of self-respect, clarity, and intention. For too long, fear kept people silent. Fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of being misunderstood or punished. That fear allowed gaslighting and guilt games to thrive, because when you doubt yourself, you are easier to manipulate. But when you start to hold firm, to define what is acceptable and what is not, the dynamic begins to change in ways that feel both liberating and disorienting. In your life, this means recognizing that saying no is not rejection, that asserting your needs is not selfish, and that protecting your mental and emotional energy is not cruelty. Gaslighting depends on confusion, on making you question your memory, your perception, your worth. But boundaries act like a lighthouse in a storm, providing a clear signal of where you stand and what you will tolerate. Once you set them, manipulation loses its grip because the rules have changed, and you are no longer playing by the old, harmful script. Guilt games, those attempts to provoke compliance through shame, begin to collapse because you refuse to internalize responsibility for someone else's distorted expectations or unmet desires. You learn to recognize the signs early, to notice when charm is a tactic, when pressure is disguised as concern, and when fear is being leveraged to keep you in line. The more you practice this, the stronger your confidence becomes, and the quieter your mind grows, even in the face of provocation. You realize that discomfort does not equal danger, that conflict does not mean failure, and that firmness is not cruelty. In your life, this translates into freedom, clarity, and empowerment. You no longer absorb others' chaos. You observe it, respond intentionally, and disengage when necessary. The collapse of gaslighting and guilt games is not dramatic or explosive. It is steady, inevitable, and undeniable. Each time you assert a boundary, you chip away at the control mechanisms that once seemed unassailable. You cultivate discernment, resilience, and self-trust, and you start to see relationships in a new light. Manipulation becomes transparent, and the power that fear once held diminishes with every act of self-respect. Over time, your interactions are no longer defined by anxiety, confusion, or compliance. Instead, they are guided by clarity, integrity, and conscious choice. Boundaries are louder than fear because they speak the language of self-worth, unwavering presence, and accountability. And in your life, that voice changes everything, shifting the balance from being controlled to being fully, unapologetically yourself. There comes a time when self-worth stops being an abstract concept and becomes a living force in your daily life. It is not something that can be borrowed, earned through approval, or validated by others. It grows quietly, steadily, and insistently from the recognition of your own value, your own boundaries, and your right to exist fully, without fear or apology. For years, narcissistic power thrived because it relied on insecurity, uncertainty, and dependence. It thrived because strong, informed minds were rare, and most people had not yet learned how to defend their inner landscape with clarity and conviction. In your life, the rise of self-worth is the turning point where manipulation loses its potency. You begin to see that no amount of charm, intimidation, or distortion can change the truth of who you are. You no longer bend yourself to fit someone else's narrative, and you no longer seek validation from those who are unwilling or incapable of giving it authentically. This rise is built on awareness, reflection, and the willingness to claim your own story without compromise. You recognize patterns that once trapped you and understand the motives behind behaviors that used to destabilize you. Knowledge becomes empowerment. Insight becomes armor. Confidence becomes a shield that protects not just your emotions, but your time, energy, and attention. The more informed and self-aware you become, the less vulnerable you are to tactics designed to confuse, coerce, or exploit. In your life, this might mean noticing manipulation before it takes hold, disengaging from conversations designed to provoke guilt or fear, or refusing to explain or justify choices that are right for you. Strong minds paired with deep self-respect are an unstoppable force because they cannot be easily swayed or shaken. Eve, wry act of clarity. Every decision made from a place of inner certainty chips away at the narcissist's influence. Over time, patterns of control crumble, not because you fight against them aggressively, but because you refuse to supply the energy that sustains them. You cultivate resilience that cannot be borrowed or stolen. You embrace an inner authority that does not require external approval. And in doing so, you model a different way of being, a way where respect, integrity, and authenticity are non-negotiable. The rise of self-worth transforms fear into empowerment, doubt into clarity, and vulnerability into strength. It allows you to navigate relationships with discernment rather than anxiety, to choose connections that honor your values rather than drain them, and to recognize that your presence is enough without needing to perform or appease. In your life, this evolution is not dramatic or sudden, but steady, profound, and undeniable. Each day you nurture your self-worth. The old scripts of manipulation lose relevance. The old patterns of control fade, and the power that once seemed unshakable begins to dissolve. Strong, informed minds are ending the narcissist's power, because when people know their value, understand their boundaries, and trust their perception, no external force can take it away. The world is shifting, and with it, the dynamics that once allowed narcissistic tactics to thrive are changing. People are waking up to the patterns of manipulation, no longer willing to absorb confusion, guilt, or control as if it were their responsibility. Awareness has become a powerful ally, illuminating the strategies that once operated in the shadows. Boundaries, once feared as confrontation, are now celebrated as statements of self-respect and clarity. Emotional intelligence transforms interactions, removing the supply that manipulation depends upon, and leaving control powerless. Each act of discernment, each refusal to compromise your integrity, chips away at the influence that once seemed insurmountable. Confidence replaces fear, insight replaces doubt, and self-worth replaces dependence on approval. The strong, informed minds of today are not only surviving, they are thriving, creating lives where manipulation has no foothold. The old games fail because they meet resistance that is calm, clear, and unwavering. The energy that once fueled control now belongs to those who refuse to be defined by someone else's chaos. And as this truth spreads, the narrative changes entirely. Power no longer resides in coercion or deception. It resides within awareness, courage, and the unshakable knowledge of one's own value, a force that nothing can diminish.